Welcome to today's Explainer. You know, if you've been watching the news lately, you might feel like you're looking at a dozen completely different puzzles. I mean, we've got wars abroad, a housing crisis right in our own backyards, soaring costs. But what if they're actually all pieces of the exact same puzzle? Today, we're going to connect the dots between these seemingly unrelated headlines to reveal just how fragile our global house of cards really is. So, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to quickly cover the sovereign debt crisis, a major geopolitical turning point, Middle East banking risks, the European housing crisis, and finally, what a completely collapsing system actually looks like. Let's just jump right in. All right, Section 1, the sovereign debt crisis, and honestly, why the math is just becoming impossible. The U.S. public debt to GDP ratio has officially crossed a massive milestone, 100.2%, reaching roughly $31.27 trillion. Now, you'll often hear the media compare today's debt to the end of World War II, but honestly, that comparison completely misses the point. After 1945, the U.S. was this exploding industrial power. Economic growth was far outpacing borrowing. But today, we're doing the exact opposite. We're borrowing heavily during an economic expansion, not to fund a world war, but simply because the financial promises that have been made are mathematically impossible to keep. Think about this permanent operating gap. Federal spending is projected to consume 23.3% of GDP, while revenues only amount to 17.5%. Just imagine walking into a grocery store and demanding to pay $1.33 for every single item that actually costs $1. That is effectively how Washington operates right now. And the kicker is, this isn't some emergency stimulus. This massive deficit has just become the permanent operating model. But the real crisis isn't just the sheer size of the debt, it's the carrying cost. Last year, net interest payments exceeded $1 trillion for the very first time. Let that sink in. That means the interest on the debt officially surpasses what Washington spends on national defense. It's kind of this dangerous fantasy to think deficits don't matter as long as you can just issue another bond, because eventually you become entirely captive to your creditors. Moving right along to Section 2, Geopolitics and Conflict, the Turning Point. To understand the geopolitical winds battering this economic foundation, the source material turns to the Socrates program. That's a computer-driven forecasting system tracking global capital flows. And it points to a July 1st economic turning point that triggers severe instability, with the Kremlin openly classifying its stance as a state of war and Ukrainian leadership escalating their own actions. Peace is looking highly unlikely. It really begs the question, are major global powers actively distracted by or maybe even reliant on conflict simply because their underlying economies are falling apart? This economic fragility actually explains why traditional military tactics are failing today. Historically, leaders relied on a pretty simple strategy, right? Take out the head of an organization and the snake dies. And sure, that works great in a highly centralized system. But nations like Iran and now Taiwan have adapted into a decentralized four-tier model. It's less like a snake and more like a hydra. If you cut off the head, the operation simply keeps going without missing a single beat. It makes traditional decapitation strikes highly ineffective, which ensures these conflicts just drag on and on. Okay, Section 3, Middle East banking risk and the global chain reaction. So, the Socrates program predicts a major shift, setting off this domino effect tied directly to oil and global debt, specifically around the first week of July. The analysis suggests a pretty terrifying reality. The real target in these modern conflicts isn't ground territory at all. It's the economic arteries of the world. Watch how fast this global house of cards can wobble. Say the Strait of Hormuz is closed. Well, Gulf state refineries suddenly can't sell their oil. And why does that matter to you and me? Because during COVID, those Gulf states borrowed extensively. If they can't export their oil, they default on those heavy debts. And guess where that debt is held? In the West. So a localized conflict shuts down oil, which stops revenue, which triggers defaults, which detonates a massive banking crisis straight into London. It is a complete domino effect. Which brings us to Section 4, European housing, an unlivable market. Now we can see how these massive macro shifts squeeze everyday citizens. According to Eurostat's Q1 2026 data, Europe's housing market isn't just struggling, it is becoming completely unlivable. While wages are stagnating, the cost of living is jumping astronomically. House prices in Portugal spiked 10.3%. Rents in Croatia exploded by an unbelievable 21.9%. That is absolutely wild. And even in countries where prices fell slightly, like France, the source notes it merely signals that consumer confidence is totally collapsing in economies under severe strain. So what's actually causing this devastating squeeze? Well, the source directly attributes it to centralized planning and government policy. Citizens are just being buried under the overlapping costs of climate mandates, endless taxation, expensive energy policies, and mass migration pressures on the housing supply. Everyday families are quite literally being priced out of their own futures because a house isn't just a home anymore. It's become this highly leveraged political and financial instrument. Finally, Section 5, a collapsing system. So, how does an unlivable rent hike in Croatia tie all the way back to a $31 trillion debt pile in Washington? It all comes down to the sovereign debt cycle. You see, sovereign debt crises never happen because a government simply runs out of money. I mean, they can always just print more, right? They end through a slow burn crisis of confidence, rising interest costs, fleeing capital, and highly skeptical lenders. To keep the illusion of solvency alive, governments desperately inflate asset values, like real estate. They tax the property, they borrow against it, and they pretend the economy is booming, while a tragic side effect unfolds in the background. Housing becomes entirely unaffordable, leading to collapsing birth rates and civil unrest. Looking at the undeniable data across staggering global debt loads, decentralized warfare, and the skyrocketing cost of just keeping a roof over your head, the math is pretty much staring us right in the face. This isn't just a temporary housing boom or a passing geopolitical spat. The source material warns this is the sign of a system breaking apart. So I'll leave you with this question to ponder. Are governments actually capable of reversing course and restoring fiscal sanity? Or are we simply waiting for the lender's confidence to completely evaporate? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll let you chew on that one.